I'll make this introduction the shortest introduction of all. We've got 20 minutes of time this morning. As you know, he is the ranking member of the House Armed Services Committee. You know that he is not afraid to wade into controversial issues. Most recently, he's had some challenges with defense funding growth with the $1.5 trillion tax cuts. He's had some controversial positions with respect to the national defense strategy and also with the nuclear posture review. Please welcome Congressman Adam Smith.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the chance to be here as always, and I think that's a pretty good summary of some of the challenges. And I think the overarching message I would deliver is the budget is still a problem, and it's still going to make it difficult as we try to plan going forward at the Department of Defense for how to meet the national security challenges that we face. To some degree, it's good that we got a budget agreement, and so supposedly we have some certainty for 2 years. But as you all know, a budget agreement is not an appropriations bill, and we still don't have the appropriations bill, and it's 6 months into the fiscal year. So the Pentagon has not known how much money they're going to have for 6 months. Now they've got 6 months to spend a lot of money. It's going to be hard to figure that out. Second, then you've got the second year of the budget agreement, and that's great. But that too is uncertain because there are certain Republicans that have already started to make noise that the non-defense discretionary, I believe the quote from Budget Director Mulvaney was, it's a floor, not a ceiling. I don't think that's the way Democrats looked at it during the course of the negotiation. So that could cause uncertainty as well. And then there's the tiny little problem of, okay, so we bought ourselves 18 months of, quote, certainty, end quote, with the caveats that I mentioned up front. But then what? Then what do we do? Because we are headed towards $22 trillion in debt. This puts us on a trajectory to have trillion-dollar deficits for as far as the eye can see. And, of course, we have the tax cut. And there was an interesting story the other day that they said the tax cut looks like it might cost more than they thought it would. Color me shocked. So, you know, it doesn't add up. And I'll spare you my long-winded speech about the budget process and how lost we are as a country in terms of understanding that, $1 worth of taxes can't buy $10 worth of services. But that's the situation we're in. And that uncertainty hangs over everything that the Pentagon tries to do. And we have major national security challenges in Russia, in China, in Iran, in North Korea, in violent Islamist extremism in many forms in many places in the world. Meeting those challenges is going to be very difficult. Having a budget that we can depend on would be helpful. So we still need to straighten that out going forward, because when you project out 10 years, it is a sea of uncertainty. I'll wait for questions to comment more on that. The other point that I want to make is in the national security strategy, they talked about how we are shifting back to great power rivalries. And I don't disagree with this. When you look at what Russia and China are doing in the world, it certainly is more aggressive and more problematic than it was even a decade ago. So how do we handle that? Now, it's different in my view. And one of the concerns I have is primarily the way the National Security Review handles it is by saying we're going to have an arms race. We do a lot of analysis of what China and Russia are doing, and then all the weapons that we have to build to counter them. Great power rivalries do not have to mean an arms race, and they certainly don't have to mean an armed conflict. It's a complex approach. How do we work with Russia? How do we contain Russia? Same with China. Part of it certainly is going to be having a credible deterrent. I completely agree with that. I have some disagreements about what's necessary to present a credible deterrent, but we have to have a strong enough military so that neither Russia nor China feel like they can do whatever they want to do. I completely agree on that point. But what is concerning to me in a great power rivalry, diplomacy and alliances are enormously important. And in that same budget document that talks about great power rivalry, we cut the State Department by 29%. And I'll put this slightly less bluntly for this audience. Let's just say that there's some problems at the State Department beyond their budget. There are career Foreign Service officers who do not feel like the department is being well run. And during my 21 years in Congress, we have never had a weaker State Department. And at the moment when you have this great power rivalry, that is an enormous problem. So we have to step up on diplomacy. Number two, we need partners. We cannot take on all of those challenges that I just listed on our own. We have got to find allies in Asia, in Europe, in Africa, across the world, to work with us, to basically see that it's better to work with us than it is to do what Russia and China want to do. You have to be able to cultivate those allies. Trade wars do not cultivate allies. Constant bluster about pulling out of trade agreements is a problem. I will also submit that we should have got rid of the America First thing a long time ago. And I get the nuanced explanations that a lot of people tell me, well, it's America first, but we do recognize that we want to work with other people. It's just we're saying we're going to put our interests first, which is like, well, duh, every country in the world puts their interests first. But when you announce as your policy America first, what that says to the rest of the world is go to hell. That's what they hear. And you can see it. And I look at a room full of people who I know travel the world, and you know that our standing in the world has never been lower. I forget exactly when these two polls were, but at one point not long ago, 48% of those people polled globally had a positive impression of America. It's now 30. All of those things are going to make great power rivalry very, very difficult. Relying on the military solely for this approach, I think, is a huge mistake. We need a comprehensive approach to meet the challenges that are out there. We need allies. We need strong diplomacy. I think we need strong development policy. That's one of the things that China certainly is doing. They're getting very aggressive about moving around the world and using their development efforts to help countries and build alliances for the future. The final thing that I will say, I confess they explained to me that the lights are going to change color at some point and that I'm supposed to do something, but I was trying to pay attention. Honest, I was. I think it's the lights are on the side there, and they're still green, so I guess I'm still okay. But we have to I think we have to put this challenge in context, because right now we're kind of moving all over the place. Well, Russia's doing this and China's doing that, and North Korea's doing what are we trying to do? I really think this is a core ideological struggle. And it is an ideological struggle between what Russia and China envision, which is authoritarianism and, frankly, kleptocracy from an economic standpoint. So a lack of freedom, a lack of economic freedom, and a lack of political freedom. That's the way they run their countries, and that's the way they want to run the world. We are supposed to be the country that stands up and says that political freedom and economic freedom is the path towards a secure and prosperous world. And therefore, we should stand up for that. That's the way I frame it, because the one thing all five of those challenges that I mentioned, Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, and even violent Islamist extremists have in common, is a desire for an authoritarian, kleptocratic approach to economics and politics. That's what they're pushing. I think it's enormously important that we find allies and work to push back. I think America should stand for economic and political freedom because it's what we were founded on, number one. And number two, it is what is most likely to lead to a more peaceful and prosperous world. So even though the lights haven't changed color, I'm going to stop talking and take your questions. Go ahead.
I'm sitting here for a reason. Hi, Sidney Friedberg, Breaking Defense. It's very interesting to hear you immediately after Senator Wicker, because who was talking about, we have to get to the 355 ships. We the Navy build plan is inadequate. Yes, we have to reduce the growth of entitlements. There's obviously a gap between your view of what's unnecessary and his. How realistic are things like a 355 ship Navy and some of the other desires of the people who are share on the committees with you on the authorizing side? How big is the gap between that and what we can actually do, short of some grand bargain to elude us?
Well, just to be blunt about it, most of those things, like a 355 ship Navy, are pure fantasy. It's simply a number thrown out there. I think they said they're their hope to achieve a 355 ship. What was it, 2050? Am I wrong about it? It was somewhere way off in the distance. It's like we can barely predict what's going to happen 2 months from now. Really? In 2050, you're going to tell me how many ships we're going to have based on everything going on? You see, I think that sort of procurement-focused approach to national security doesn't give us a good strategy and doesn't recognize the budget reality. And part of what we need to do in our national security strategy, I think, is to have it step back a little bit to match what our likely resources are going to be. And I said I wasn't going to give you the long speech about our budget problem. I'll give you the short version of it. The American people have come to expect a balanced budget with no tax increases and no spending cuts. I have a more sophisticated way of explaining that, but if you look at the polling data, that's basically where we are at. Most politicians promise that. You talk to politicians in competitive races, they will say they're for a balanced budget agreement. Just try to pin them down on what tax it is they want to raise or what spending program it is they want to cut. Can't be done. And this has spread to both parties. And it's actually worse than most people think. Most people think, well, the Republicans, they want to cut entitlements, but they don't want to raise taxes. Democrats want to raise taxes, but they don't want to cut entitlements. It's war, but neither party wants to do either one of those things, all right? Because they poll badly, as I said earlier. This all comes back to the fact that we, over the succession of, not me, because as you well know, I don't do this, but most politicians running for office have promised more than we can possibly deliver. And the American people have come to expect it. But we can't deliver it. So that is the trap we're in. That's why we wind up with CRs. That's why the government gets shut down, because there is no path forward to something that people are going to accept because they have a sort of fantasy island expectation about what can be accomplished. So talking about 355 ships or 500,000 troops in the Army or whatever doesn't match up to the reality of dealing with taxes and mandatory spending. I mean, we just cut taxes again, reducing our revenue. And by the way, if cutting taxes increased revenue, I'd have the easiest job in the world. Number one. And number two, the best tax rate you could possibly have to bring in the most money would be zero. So obviously there is a flaw in that logic. Yes, if taxes get to a certain height, bringing them down can spur economic activity, but look at the history, look at the economics. We were not at that place. So we've just gutted our revenue. And then on mandatory spending programs, Republicans love to talk about it. They love to say, oh, no one wants to do that. They've been in charge of Congress, the House and the Senate at least, since 2011. Where's the bill? If this was such a huge priority for them, where is the piece of legislation reforming our mandatory spending programs to get the costs under control? They haven't even introduced it, much less voted on it, because it's politically unpopular. So they have no will whatsoever to do the very thing that they keep complaining that we need to do. But they do, meanwhile, continue to cut taxes and continue to make the problem worse. Step one in all of this is an honest conversation about the choices that we face. And if there's one thing no politician in this country wants to have, or very few politicians in this country want to have, it is an honest conversation about this, because there's no easy answer. People don't like tax increases. They don't like cuts to programs. How do you do that? How do you make a budget work that is as far out of whack as ours is? So yeah, it's far easier to sort of divide and conquer. All right, you're talking to the Navy. What do you want to tell? Well, here's how many ships you need. You're talking to the Army. Here's how large we want the force to be. You're talking to a bunch of seniors. You talk about how much you're going to protect Social Security and Medicare. Nobody talks about the whole. As somebody said back in the 1980s, the budget deficit does not have a constituency, and that is the single greatest problem we face in trying to deal with it. But if we don't deal with it, it will be the gravest threat to our national security that we face. I'm sorry, and then after that, we get Congressman Moran.
Good morning, Congressman. Otto Kreischer with Sea Power Magazine. Senator Wicker was very confident it would get the omnibus passed by March 24th. Do you agree with that? And since we're going to be giving the DOD its budget halfway through the fiscal year, how are you guys going to handle them they're spending all that extra money in so little time. Are you going to give them the ability to spend into the next FY?
I'm not very confident of anything from a legislative standpoint. I have an enormous amount of respect for Senator Wicker, so I hope he's right. I believe that it will happen. I do believe that we will get an omnibus by March 25th, but there's still a couple things to jump over. Yes, I think we should ultimately give authority. Well, look, what's going to happen is the Pentagon's not going to be able to spend all the money. So we are going to get a lot of requests for reprogramming along the way. Whether or not we do something formally, as you described, and give them the authority to spend the money in the new year, I don't know. But we are going to set a record for reprogramming requests starting about the second half of this year. And you know, we'll see what those reprogramming requests are and which ones the majority wants to grant and don't. But that's the way I think they'll handle the extra money for the last 6 months. Oh, yes, Jim.
So, Adam, there's increasing speculation that the House could change hands in November. That would make you chair of the House Armed Services Committee. Could you share with us what you would anticipate in terms of any changes in defense spending and priorities?
Sure. After I get done slamming my head against the wall about the incredibly deep hole that we're in, and actually start to think about how to get out of it. I mean, part of the premise, my premise is, we have to have a national security strategy that at least is in the same book as the amount of money that we have, because we are not there. And I will share with you, I think, one of the best examples of what I'm talking about. A little less than a year ago, Chairman Thornberry and I met with the Office of Net Assessment to talk generally about what their projections were going forward for our national security strategy and the budget. And the gentleman that we were meeting with said, it's so bad, we do not have the money to meet our 2012 national security strategy. So I asked him, I said, well, how short are you? And he actually looked at me like he didn't understand the question. So I had to explain. I said, well, you said, you don't have enough money to meet your 2012 strategy. You have a certain amount of money. You have your 2012 strategy. What's the gap? He did not have an answer. Didn't know. That doesn't really make any sense. He knew he was short, had no idea by how much. And that's sort of the general theme throughout the Pentagon is we know all the things that we don't have that we wish we had. But do we have an overarching strategy? So step number one for me would be, let's look at a realistic budget. And instead of fantasizing about a 355-ship Navy, my problem with the nuclear posture review and what it's doing is we're going to spend an enormous amount of money on that. And how does that fit into all this other strategy? Where can we save money? That's the number one question that I'm going to ask. Because everything that I've seen the last couple of years in the Armed Services Committee is Pentagon officials coming over and saying, here's where we are desperately short, where China, Russia, every player that they have us outgunned, they're developing better than we are, it's a nightmare, it's terrible, we need more of this. That's great. We can't address that if we don't also answer the question, where can we save money? How can we get smarter about it? And, we're talking about the nuclear posture review and part of nuclear, oh my gosh, China's modernizing their nuclear weapons. China has 250 nuclear warheads. Now, I do admit, from what I understand, they're going to build more. We have over 4,000. So China has a very simple nuclear deterrent strategy. They have enough powerful nuclear weapons that if you push them to the brink, they can do enormous damage to you. That strikes me as a remarkably reasonable strategy. Instead, we're building out a strategy that we got to match everything that everybody else in the world is doing and then exceed it. We can't afford that. So I really want to look at how do we put together a strategy that we can afford. And then the other piece of that is the only way it works, in my view, is to build partnerships. Like I said, to have friends and allies across the world. And we've done some of that in the last couple of decades. There are places in the world where we have friends and allies. We need more if we're going to meet our national security strategy going forward.
Sir, can I throw out the maybe the last question? The 2019 markup will be coming soon. What are the priorities that? A two-part question actually. What are you most proud about in the 2018 NDAA that you cared about? And then number two, what are going to be your priorities? Whether you're the ranking member or perhaps even the chairman, what are going to be your priorities for the 2019 NDAA?
Well, I think it's some of the same answers. I think the thing that I'm most proud of is a lot of the work that we've done in a bipartisan way on acquisition reform and procurement reform. I think Chairman Thornberry, Chairman McCain have offered tremendous leadership on trying to figure out how can we get more for the money that we spend, which is a slightly different question than the one I addressed with Jim, which is, how can we save money and meet a national security strategy? It's like, whatever we're buying, how can we buy it smarter? We're moving towards more commercial off-the-shelf technology. We are trying to speed up the process in a variety of different ways. And I think that our current team at the Pentagon is doing a great job. Secretary Mattis, Deputy Secretary Shanahan, Undersecretary Lord, the secretaries of the various branches. I think we've got a great team in there to try to get the most out of the money we spend. So the acquisition reform and procurement reform is the thing that I'm most proud of. And that's the thing that I think I would prioritize and work on going forward as well, is how can we get that so that regardless of all the bigger picture stuff that I talked about, let's make sure that we're getting the most out of every dollar that we spend. All right. Thank you very much.